Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Benjamin Quinn, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's event with Zoë Playdon, discussing her book, The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, and the Unwritten History of the Trans Experience. Tonight's event is part of our ongoing virtual event series. As we remain digital for the time being, we're so excited to continue the work of bringing authors and their writing to our ever-expanding community during these difficult times. For tonight's event, we will conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask the speaker something, locate the Q&A function wherever it may live on your Zoom display, where you can submit all your questions. We'll get through as many as time allows. If you go to the chat section, I will shortly be posting a link to our website where you can purchase your own copy of The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes. If you already have a copy of the book or would like to contribute to our series and our store in a different way, I will also be posting in the chat a link to our website's donation function. We greatly appreciate any and all support you are able to extend to us at this time. Please note that closed captioning is available for this broadcast. Depending on which version of Zoom you are using, you may need to enable it yourself by simply locating the button marked Live Transcript on your display and clicking through all the options. And one final note, as you have no doubt experienced during virtual gatherings this last year, technical issues may come up. If any glitches do occur, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now it is my sincere pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. For over 30 years, Zoë Playdon has been on the front lines of the fight for LGBTI human rights, serving as co-chair of the Gay and Lesbian Association of Doctors and Dentists and co-founding the Parliamentary Forum on Gender Identity in 1994. The recipient of 5 degrees, including 2 doctorates, she is the Emeritus Professor of Medical Humanities at the University of London, a visiting professor at the University of Cumbria, and an honorary research fellow at Birkbeck College. Tonight, Professor Playdon has joined us for a discussion of her book, The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes, an enlightening investigation into a largely hidden corner of trans history that has been rightfully hailed by Jennifer Finney Boyland as abundant with compassion, clarity, and meticulous research. Introducing us to Ewan Forbes, a trans Scotsman whose successful defense of his male status in 1965 would have altered the course of transgender history, had the events of his trial not been hidden from the public and historical record. The case remained unknown until 1996 and is now finally described here in a groundbreaking detective story which Lord Cashman calls a breathtaking story, magnificently researched and told, and which lays bare how rights are fought for, how they are always under attack, and as well as the human suffering discrimination perpetuates. We are so thrilled to be hosting this event tonight. Without further ado, Professor Playdon, the digital podium is all yours.
Thank you, Benjamin. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you and to everyone at the event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a bit about how I came across The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes. Then I'll tell you something about Ewan and his life and the case itself. I'll move on to talk about the consequences of the case, which were huge and wide-ranging, and then think a bit about how trans communities have started to recover from that. And I'll intend to leave 15 minutes at least at the end for any questions. So, how did I come across The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes? Well, in February 1996, myself and legal colleagues had just lost a case in our High Court. We'd gone to try to get trans people's birth certificates corrected. We'd shown that in the past they were corrected and argued that as a matter of natural justice, they should be corrected now. And we'd failed, and we didn't understand why we'd failed. And then that evening, I was tipped off about another case. My informant was a solicitor, a man who had worked with the famous trans woman, famous in the UK trans woman, April Ashley, in 1970. And it was April's case that marked a big change in trans fortunes. And her solicitor, Terence, said that everyone blamed him and April for trans people not being able to correct their birth certificates. And thus not having any real legal identity. But, he said, before he and April went into court, they were taken into the judge's chambers and they were shown another earlier case. And they were told that everyone who knew about the case had been sworn to secrecy, which now included them, that they couldn't use the case or plead against it, they couldn't use it in their own court case. And they were told that all records of it had been removed from the public eye because, Terence said, there were some things that it's more important to protect than the rights of individuals. Well, you know, this is a big shock because in the UK, our law works by case law. On the one hand, we have statutory law, the kind of laws that Parliament passes, and obviously they're published and public and we all know what they are. But on the other hand, we have our law proceeds through judgments in courts, and those judgments stand unless they're overturned by a more senior court at some future point. So you need to know what was pleaded in a court and what the decision was in every case, because otherwise, fundamentally, you don't know what law to follow. So removing a case from public view was effectively unconstitutional and undemocratic. And it was difficult, frankly, it was difficult to believe that that had happened because, you know, people have conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. But still, coming from such an authoritative source, I felt it had better be checked out. And with colleagues, we felt that this was probably going to be a trans man, it was probably going to be an aristocrat, and it was probably going to be about a title that was limited by primogeniture. One of the great benefits of being in the USA is that you don't have the law of primogeniture like we do. It's archaic, inherited from the Norman conquest in 1066. When William the Conqueror conquered Britain and gave all of its land to his barons, he instituted the law of primogeniture, which meant that those lands and titles could only be inherited by the next male heir in line, never by a woman. And his idea was that there would be an undisturbed succession of men who owed him allegiance because he was protecting their titles. It's still in existence. It must sound bizarre to you. It certainly sounds bizarre to most of us over here that we have this system of systemic sex discrimination where there are some titles and estates that women can never inherit. And just to give you a sense of the force of that, what that means if you are one of the women born into one of those families. This is what one of my interviewees said. Her family had a title that was ruled by primogeniture. She said, I knew, I absorbed it with my mother's milk that as a girl I was a disappointment, just a piece of human flotsam to be fed, clothed, housed, for the intention and purpose was to have a boy. Only boys counted, only boys were valued, only boys were desirable, lovable and precious. Girls, just a burden to maintain in the short term and an anxiety for the future. For I knew certainly and automatically that when my father died, I would have to leave my home and the belongings I thought were mine. For as a girl, I was always already disinherited. So this strange piece of British history still exerts a strong influence on the country today. In 2013, the Queen got rid of primogeniture for the monarchy. Before then, it was always a primogeniture monarch. We only have a queen because there were no eligible males to become king. In 2013, it ended for the crown. It continues for hundreds of other titles. And in the last 6 years, there have been 6 attempts by Parliament to get rid of primogeniture, and they've all failed. That was 1 bill a year for 6 years. And I'm building up all of this stuff about primogeniture because it's a crucial issue. It was the determining issue in the case of Ewan Forbes, and it was the determining issue in the future of trans people worldwide. How could that be? Okay, here's Ewan then. Ewan is born in 1912. He's the son of a Scots aristocratic family, the Forbes Semples. They're very distinguished. They're not grand. They're not dukes or marquises. They're just baron and baronets. But they are very distinguished. Their title is amongst the oldest in Scotland. Their seat is Fintry Manor and the iconic Craigavon Castle, the lovely pink castle that some people say inspired Walt Disney's Cinderella Castle. And their Ewan's grandfather was a close friend of Queen Victoria. His mother was a close friend of Queen Mary. His father was aide-de-camp to the king at Balmoral. The Queen's home is just down the road, so to speak. They were influential and they were wealthy. When Ewan was born, he was assigned female birth, but it rapidly became clear to his mother that he wasn't a girl. And this, I think, is remarkable, really, for the period. And so she allowed him to dress and play as he wanted, called him Benji, and which, because she said, like Benjamin, he was her youngest child, and got her friends and so on to call him Benji, so he didn't have to have a girl's name, and homeschooled him so that he didn't have to go to a girls' boarding school. Now, as we all know now, it's okay when the kid's little, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can let them get on and explore and watch and see, you know, have we got the familiar pattern of someone who is insistent and persistent and consistent in their gender identity? Is it kind of a phase or what? And we don't have to do much more than watch, because, you know, the child will tell us who they are. And this is what Ewan's mother did. But then, of course, there's the fear of puberty. In those days, puberty came later, but even so, it was an anxiety for Ewan and his mother, because in those days, there were no puberty blockers to buy time for decision making. Astonishingly, though, his mother sought out all of the senior medical specialists in Europe. At the time, and again, Ewan was lucky when he was born, testosterone and estrogen were being synthesized in laboratories across Europe as part of experiments in early endocrinology. And Ewan's mother, the Lady Semple, Gwendolen, took him on a European tour, disguised as a cultural tour. They visited all of the major European cities. He saw just about everyone who was doing anything in trans healthcare. And in effect, he was a guinea pig for early testosterone. So Ewan managed to avoid going through the wrong puberty. Over here in the UK, we wouldn't now give cross-sex hormones to someone so young, although it's debatable really as to whether one should just go with the stage rather than the age. And my view is one should always go with the stage of development rather than the calendar age. But still, we didn't have any of those concerns in the 1920s. They weren't concerns for Ewan. His concern and his mother's concern was that he shouldn't go through the wrong puberty, and he didn't. And this is a remarkable achievement. And we might just think simply lucky Ewan, and we'd be right to think that this was hugely privileged. But that came at a price. His family, remember, is very distinguished. They're in the public eye, and his father was a stickler for etiquette. And this meant that on public occasions, when his father required it, Ewan had to be forced into a dress and appear in public as a girl. Now, of course, we would think of this as unimaginably brutal, to do that to any trans boy. But they were harsher times, I guess. And perhaps his parents weren't fully aware of what they were doing. And certainly they had this iron bondage of duty. You know, you had to obey duty. So that when Ewan was 16, and, you know, he was growing chest hair and facial hair and so on, he had to force himself into a long white dress and have feathers in his hair and be presented to the Queen as a debutante in the formal coming out ceremony, which must have been dreadful and must have had an enduringly damaging psychological effect. However, he managed, he got through this, and cleverly, he developed a neat strategy for having to appear in public to satisfy his parents' demands. They were both very skilled traditional dancers, and Ewan started a dance team, Dancers of Don, and he himself always danced the male part, so that now he could appear in male dress, in public, dancing, and be applauded for it as well, which was, you know, well done, Ewan, I think. Jolly good trick. So, Ewan's got to make his way in the world. No matter what we might think, as far as his father was concerned, the whole of the estate was going to go to Ewan's older brother, because he's the next in line. And the baronetcy was a primogeniture baronetcy. So Ewan's older brother William was going to inherit everything. And when his father died, Ewan knew that he would have, well, you know, some money left to him, but otherwise nothing. So he had to make his way in the world. He enrolled in Aberdeen Medical School. During World War II, he was a medical student and qualified at the end of the war. He became a family doctor in a little local market town of Arford and was happy. People who live in Arford who still remember Ewan as a GP say he was great. He was really nice, he was charming, and he had this reputation that no matter how high the river or how bad the storm, Ewan would get to his patients, because many of them were hill farmers living in crofts in the Scots Highlands, and Ewan would, you know, go as far as he could by car, then he'd take to skis or snowshoes or ride. He would get there, he would get to his patients, and he was, you know, much loved. In 1952, then, by now Ewan's 40, he falls in love. It's the daughter of a hill farmer who takes his attention, Isabella Mitchell, always known to everyone as Patty. And again, everyone I've spoken to who remembers Patty says she was adorable. She was kind and warm and lovely and just, a very cozy person. Ewan falls in love with Patty and wants to marry. And to do so, he has to correct his birth certificate. Now, that would be a big deal today, well, an impossibility today. Although we still have the legal facility for correcting birth certificates, that's now restricted to a very, very few cases and is rare. But not then. At that period, it was customary, usual, for trans people to correct their birth certificates. As I say, you self-identified, you got affirmative medical care, and by the 1950s, you could get that on the NHS. It was available to everyone, And once you'd had your affirmative medical care, you took a letter from your doctor to the Central Registry Office and corrected your birth certificate and lived in full legal equality in your proper sex. It was a bit more complicated in Scotland than England. In Scotland, you had to have the signatures from 3 doctors, but it was still relatively straightforward. And so this is what Ewan did. Because the family was in the public eye, he got unwelcome attention from the press, who blocked the road so that he couldn't drive to his family doctor practice and get to his patients. But Ewan was very resourceful. He had a Land Rover, like a Jeep, and he drove across the moors and the hills and avoided the roads and avoided the press. And he and Patty lived happily. I mean, just ordinarily, that's all the man ever wanted, was just to live an ordinary, happy life, serving his community, seeing his family, falling out with some of them and getting on with some of them, and just, you know, he had a farm that he liked to farm. He liked his patients. He was a big member of his local church, the Kirk, as it's called in Presbyterian Scots worship. And that was him. And he would have continued unremarkably, completely happily, until in 1965, December 1965, his older brother William died. Well, this was problematic. The press had already picked up on Ewan's correction of his birth certificate, and they'd already wondered whether that meant that he would get the title, the baronetcy. It's a Forbes of Craigavon baronetcy is a primogeniture title. It has to go to the next male in line. If there is no male in line anywhere in the whole of the extended family, then the baronetcy just dies. Otherwise, it goes to the next male in line. Legally, that should have been Ewan, and perhaps Ewan would have taken it, or perhaps he wouldn't have bothered. The title doctor was the one that he loved. But at his brother's funeral, a cousin turned up, someone no one had seen before. None of the family had ever seen this cousin, John. Cousin John turns up and at the funeral says to Ewan, actually, I think I'm going to put him for the baronetcy, on the grounds that, well, you're not a real man, are you? And this was devastating for Ewan. What to do? All his life, Ewan had only wanted a peaceful existence, and his automatic strategy was to appease. When his older sister Margaret, who had a very sharp temper, became angry, he'd always been brought up to appease her. When his father demanded things and was in one of his black moods, the family rule was appease. And so that's what Ewan did with John. He tried to appease him. He signed an agreement with John that said that he, Ewan, would hand over the whole of the estate. Craigavon Castle by then belonged to the National Trust for Scotland, but we're still talking about 20,000 acres of land and family heirlooms, paintings, and jewellery that go back to the 1600s. He said, I'll give you all of that, John, if you will just not go for the baronetcy. When I die, you'll get the baronetcy anyway. So can you just wait for me to die and meanwhile have 20,000 acres of land and all of the family heirlooms? And John agreed to that. And once he'd got it, he changed his mind and carried on going for the baronetcy. But Ewan was sort of on, it was unpleasant, but it wasn't kind of dangerous at that point. All of the medical records of his treatment were gone with the past. The only living relative he had, close relative that he had left, was his sister Margaret. And so he thought, well, what could John do about it anyway? His birth certificate had been corrected. Where was the problem? Unfortunately, Ewan was estranged from his sister, and his sister was in financial difficulties. And so John approached her and said, I'll pay your debts if you'll write me a letter. Write me a letter saying that to your sure and certain knowledge, Ewan is female and always has been. And Ewan's sister Margaret wrote the letter. Well, why was that such a bombshell for Ewan? Ewan, remember, was a doctor. That meant that he had the inside track to what was going on in medicine. And he was a trans man. So you can be sure that he was keeping a very sharp eye on what was happening in trans medicine. And what was happening wasn't good. In the United States, there was a turf war at the start of the 1960s between endocrinologists and psychiatrists. Up to that point, being trans had been classified as an intersex condition, treatable by endocrinology and reconstructive surgery where required, but essentially just another diversity of sex development. We know that biologically, every fetus starts as female. It proceeds along a route that can take it to male, so that we know that, biologically, sex is on a spectrum with a lot of people at the predominantly female end, a lot of people at the predominantly male end, and a small percentage of people somewhere in the middle. That's just, basic science. And so to medicine at that period, it only made sense that being trans was an intersex condition. But a group of psychiatrists challenged that. They said it wasn't an endocrinological condition, that the affirmative care that was being given was quite wrong. They claimed that it was a mental illness, like being gay. In their view, it was also a mental illness. And in 1962, the first gender identity research clinic was opened at the University of California, Los Angeles, to cure gay men, lesbians, and trans people with a range of punitive methods. Electroconvulsive therapy, frontal lobotomy, aversion therapy using chemicals to induce vomiting, aversion therapy using electric shocks, abusive psychotherapy. This was the regimen that Ewan feared. It wasn't just that this was happening in the US. There was a move to import that to the UK. And Ewan knew that instead of being classified as intersex, if he was challenged in court and the new medical viewpoint was asserted, he would be regarded as mentally ill, as floridly psychotic is the term. A floridly psychotic lesbian who had contracted a perjured marriage with another lesbian, and both of them due 2 years in prison for perjury, their lives ruined, pilloried by the press, and him struck off the General Medical Council's register. This was what Ewan feared. And when he found out about Margaret's letter, his fears started to come home, because that could be persuasive evidence in court. He reconciled with his sister. He got her on his side. We wonder whether she was sort of bidding for her support, but certainly Ewan got her on side. she persuaded cousin John to agree to the court hearing in which he wanted to challenge Ewan for the title, to agree to the court hearing being held in private. And perhaps she was concerned that if the press got hold of Ewan, they might also get hold of her, because she herself had a female life partner. So there's a sort of uneasy truce. John has said, okay, we can have the court case heard in private, provided that Ewan pays for my court fees, all of my legal fees, and agrees to an examination by independent medical experts of my choice. Ewan agrees to this. He thinks to himself, well, John's got no evidence. Now that Margaret's on his side, in court she can say, oh, well, I did write that letter. I didn't really understand what it was for. And in any event, John told me what to put in it, and he paid me for it. And its credibility is destroyed. And perhaps that's what would have happened, except that driving to meet her newly reconciled brother along a road, usually empty, which she'd driven in hundreds of times before, driving that sturdiest of British vehicles, the Land Rover, unexpectedly, Margaret met a lorry and a car, and in the headlong crash was killed instantly. Ewan had to submit to a degrading medical examination, and the report, when it came from a very senior anatomist, said unequivocally that Ewan was female, with some masculine characteristics that could be caused by conditions such as congenital adrenal hyperplasia. And it looked as though John had won game, set and match, and that Ewan was done for. Well, he wasn't. You'll have to read the book to find out how he gets out of this. It's too complicated to explain in a brief presentation. But suffice it to say that his defense was audacious and crazy and just remarkable, that he and his wife were put through 3 days of questioning that was appalling and pornographic, honestly, that certainly wouldn't have been allowed in a courtroom today. But that nevertheless, Ewan won. He got his baronetcy. He became Sir Ewan Forbes of Craigiebar. And he caused a constitutional crisis, because remember, the baronetcy is subject to primogeniture. At this time, the crown is subject to primogeniture. A trans man has just taken a primogeniture title. If a trans man can become a baronet, a trans man can become king. And constitutional law is all about succession to the throne, which is deemed to be crucial for political stability. You need to know who the next heir is. Now, though, you might think you know who the next male heir is, and find out that they've got an older sibling, assigned female at birth, who's trans and who claims the throne instead. Or you might find that the apparent heir, assigned male at birth, is trans and no longer eligible. Suddenly, Ewan's case had upset the apple cart of the British establishment, and things had to be put right. They were put right very quickly through another case, the case of April Ashley. This is the case that my informant told me was involved in. The informant that told me about Ewan was involved in. This is the case of the famous, very beautiful trans woman, April Ashley, who had contracted a marriage with the son of Lord Roe Allen, They didn't get on. He wanted to divorce her. And April hadn't actually corrected her birth certificate. So in fact, it was a perjured marriage. And the usual procedure was for those to just be dismissed out of court. It was like a common law marriage. It wasn't legal, and so there never had been a marriage. And so there was nothing really to divorce. But instead of taking that reasonable route, the judge chose to set up a long 14-day hearing full of all sorts of, again, medical tests for April. And he used the occasion to outlaw trans people. He did this by creating a sex test. Now, this wasn't scientific and it wasn't medical. It was purely legal. It actually flew in the face of senior medical opinion. But by that time, the US pseudo-medicine declaring trans people to be mentally ill had started to creep into the UK. And it was that the judge in April's case relied on to declare that April wasn't a woman, that she was a homosexual transvestite, and that she couldn't marry as a woman. The way in which he went about this was bizarre in the extreme. He focused particularly on April's vagina. He asked senior obstetricians to carry out a medical examination. They wrote a report saying, well, you know, it's a vagina and it's honestly no different from anyone else's vagina, except that it's lubricated rather differently. That didn't suit the judge. He made them write the report again, and this time call it an artificial vagina. And in his summing up, he said that having sex using April's vagina was the same as anal intercourse, because the vagina was just a matter of centimeters away from her anus. And every time I look at that, I just wonder where he thought everyone else's vagina was. And actually, whatever Lady Ormrod told him about the location of her vagina. The most bizarre, strange judgment that I think I've ever seen. But it was decisive. Had Ewan's case been available, he would never have dared to make the judgment, I don't think. Ewan's case was heard in Scotland's most senior civil court. This was just being heard in an English divorce court. You know, very small beans. But anyway, it wasn't, it had been hidden. And there we are. The judgment was made. The judge created a sex test, and the decision in April Ashley's case, the case is called Corbett versus Corbett, turned into a super precedent. It was cited worldwide. It was cited in the US, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, and in continental Europe. So if you're trans and you've lost your civil liberties, you've lost equality, pretty much anywhere in the world, it's because of Corbett and Corbett, which in turn is the cure that the judge created to protect primogeniture from the effects of the hidden case of Ewan Forbes. Poor April. She believed, you know, that this decision was just for the purpose of marriage, that everything else would be fine, you know, that she'd be treated perfectly equally in every other aspect of her life. Just marriage was the glitch. And then suddenly, invisibly, without any discussion in Parliament, without any new statutes being passed, trans people lost their civil liberties. They lost their employment rights. Not only were they unable to marry, but they were unable to adopt. If they couldn't afford to pay their car parking fines, then they'd be sent to the wrong sex prison, where women certainly were raped without it counting legally as rape. They became subjected to a punitive medical regime, which included compulsory sterilisation. They were socially excluded. Let me give you a sense of what this was like if you were trans in the UK from 1970 to 1996. This is the advice that was given to you. Pay privately for all your health care. Present yourself in this way. Always say this, never say that. Hope to stay alive during the process. Expect to lose your friends. Expect to lose your family. Expect to have to sell your house, change your job, move somewhere you're unknown. If you're married, the doctors will make you divorce before they'll treat you. And if you have children, expect never to see them again. Don't expect sympathy or understanding from anyone. If you're a member of a church, expect the congregation to expel you. If you're a member of a club, expect to get barred. And if you play sport, expect to be banned. Never get in trouble with the police. Never tell anyone about your past. Think before you say anything. Make yourself invisible. And if you see trouble coming up the street towards you, get out of the way or take a beating or worse. You're safe in your own home or in the home of trans friends, but not traveling between the two. You're safe in the local lesbian and gay club, but if you end up floating in the canal at the back, be sure the police won't investigate. Now you're on your own and outside society, and you're not even a statistic. This is the level of social exclusion that the hidden case of Ewan Forbes created for trans people in the UK and after Corbett versus Corbett worldwide. Over here, that was the status quo for 26 years until 1996, when a case called P versus S and Cornwall County Council, a trans woman called P, took the UK government to court in the European Court of Justice for the right to work. She claimed that she had a right to earn a living and thus to live the same as everyone else. And she won. It was a landmark case, the first time anywhere in the world that case law had prevented discrimination against someone on the grounds that they were trans. It also launched a whole series of new trans activism. In the UK, trans activism has tended to focus on legal and administrative change, while in the US, it's been very, very powerful indeed in creating new cultural theory and trans theory. Where does that leave us all now? Well, on the one hand, it's pretty desperate. You know, the US has only just come out of a period in which trans people have seen rights disappear again, and that some of them are only just being restored. In the UK, with a similar alt-right administration, we're seeing trans people becoming a sort of a wedge issue for an attack on women's reproductive rights. And the action plan to restore LGBT rights and equality that was going ahead was in 2019 by the current Prime Minister ended, closed. The committee that had that was supporting it was closed, and the Women and Equalities Committee has been proposed to be closed. So things are pretty dark on that hand. On the other hand, though, perhaps I'm just an eternal optimist, I don't know. But on the other hand, we have this amazing new Generation Z, if I'm saying that right. I am a boomer, so I do apologise for that. We have this amazing new generation of young trans people who've grown up without the kind of exclusion that the 1970 to 96 generation experienced, and have instant community worldwide through the internet, and who assert their rights to autonomy and self-identity far more strongly than ever before. And so I think that, you know, it is going to take time. It won't be easy. But I do think that in the end, the legacy of the hidden case of Ewan Forbes will be finally left behind. And I do look forward to trans equality in my lifetime. Thank you. Happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So we do have a few questions in the queue. Do feel free to submit more, everyone in the audience. I want to start with this one, which came in shortly after you spoke about the primogenitor. So I'm going to put it in the context of that. But a questioner asks, the question of Ewan's gender became a point of contention when his cousin began to covet his baronetcy. Today, trans people are similarly targeted for the ways that their lives upset and uproot ideologies of identity that are intrinsic to systems of authority, commerce, distribution, etc. Do you think that the case of Ewan Forbes provides an important mirror for today's contention?
Oh, yes. I mean, absolutely. You know, right from Judith Butler onwards, it's been very evident that trans bodies disturb just about everything. And in a way, it's sort of strange, though, don't you think, Benjamin, that they didn't used to? It's kind of, okay, through the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, they were all right. In the start of the 60s, they didn't disturb people. And then suddenly they did. And it feels to me very much like a manufactured panic. Over here, one of the things that I note is that in 1967 over here, we had the partial decriminalisation of gay men through the Sexual Offences Act. And it almost coincides exactly with the start of the demonisation of trans people. And I think one of the lessons that we can take from Ewan's case is that it doesn't have to be like that. Yes, I absolutely agree that the whole social construct of hierarchy is challenged by trans people, but it doesn't need to be. It isn't immutable. It isn't a kind of a given. It isn't that everyone is terrified and that things will go wrong. I think one of the things we can take from Ewan's life is, first of all, we've got over 100 years of trans kids getting affirmative medical care and it working out just fine. And secondly, we've got 50 years of trans people getting affirmative medical care and having equality. And apart from upsetting primogenitor, it working out just fine. And really the question is, what really is the problem? Now, I know that if you've got fixed ideological views, then it will be distressing. I understand that absolutely. But at the end of the day, you know, while we make every accommodation for fixed ideologies, so in medicine, for example, if you're a Jehovah's Witness and you won't take blood transfusions, then during procedures like heart replacement, special equipment is used to recirculate your own blood so that you don't have to have a transfusion, but you can still have the surgery. And yes, it takes longer. It's probably double the cost and it's far more people in the operating theatre. But the point is that we accommodate that. What we don't do with fixed ideology is to let it dominate our society. Yeah, we treat it supportively and sympathetically, but we don't let it make laws for the majority. And what concerns me is that we appear to be letting fixed ideology that denies science and denies the cultural reality of trans people, we seem to be letting that dominate society and believe it should be making laws for us. If we start there, then we end up getting rid of Roe versus Wade, basically.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to this question because I'm so interested in what you had sort of said about the manufactured panic.
Mm.
And I think this sort of might vary from area to area, country to country, but you acknowledge that there was a period in which trans lives were respected and understood, and the medical establishment made space for them and allowed them to legally change their name. But then something shifted. There was this return to this sort of value that didn't really make sense in the 60s. And I was wondering if you might have any idea of where that strictness, where that firmness came from, especially in the community that surrounded you in Forbes.
Mm. It comes, I think, in two directions. Certainly we have this fear, this post-war fear, certainly in the US, you know, the so-called Lavender Menace, the Homintern, as it's sometimes called, the demonization of gay men. And we have to bear in mind that at this period, gender, sex, and sexuality were all collapsed together. The idea was, the reigning idea was, they called it the law of the sexual homologous development. The idea was that right people were male, masculine, and heterosexual, or female, feminine, and heterosexual. Anything that disturbed that was wrong, and so gay men and lesbians were automatically wrong, and trans people were often just lumped in with gay men and lesbians, so that, you know, during the Nazi period, trans women were given the same pink triangle as gay men, and trans men were given the same black triangle as lesbians, and they were both sent to death camps, you know. So there wasn't that separation. But on the whole, trans people did manage to escape the worst of it in a civilized society because they were regarded as being intersex. And then there's this big attempt to cure people. Now, I don't know where the pressure came from, but I think it came from multiple locations. One of the dreadful stories, I call it a story, I have to accept it as truth. This was from a guy, Professor Richard Green, who was one of the people at the Association of Psychiatrists producing the DSM. Richard told me that when all of the proposals for taking homosexuality out of the DSM were kicking around the APA, and there was a sort of a decision that was going to happen, he said, well, he said, I was in the bar, you know, he said, and everybody was saying, well, it's all very well, isn't it, taking homosexuality out of the DSM. But, you know, some of us have got bills to pay, got kids to put through college. It leaves a gap. And said Richard, someone else said, why don't we put transsexualism in instead? And everyone went high five. That was Richard's story. He saw it as being created to protect financial interests of a coterie of psychiatrists who made their living by curing gay men and lesbians. And now that market was drying up because homosexuality was being decriminalized. They needed another income source. I mean, you do have to hope, I hope, that Richard was kind of exaggerating. But there's another part of you that just said, oh God, that sounds so horrible it could be true. So coming from a range of areas, always we have this undercurrent of fundamentalist, very right-wing evangelical belief, you know, from any of the Abrahamic religions, really, but strongly expressed through evangelical Christianity and its right-wing conservative groups. And then we have, in parallel with them, people who aren't quite worshipping, but who share those values. They're kind of secular fundamentalists. Over here, we call them trans-exclusionary radical feminists, because their whole idea is that trans people should be excluded from society. And they refer that to radical feminism. And they'll occasionally quote bits from radical feminism very tediously, in the same way that Christian evangelists will use proof texts, little bits from Leviticus or where have you to advance their argument. So there's this sort of witch's brew of religious fundamentalism, potentially medical self-interest. Certainly, it's a great diversion over here. If you're a government that's making a mess of absolutely everything, is broadly dishonest in a way that both Trump and our current Prime Minister are viewed as by many as being broadly dishonest, then having somebody to scapegoat and take attention away as a diversion is a political tactic as well. It's not good. I mean, if we just start from the other end and say, who should be equal in a democratic society? Then the answer is everyone should be equal simply by virtue of being born. That's it, without any qualification. No ifs, no buts. Equality is the basic birthright of every human being.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to this question, this wonderful question that came in just a minute ago. The questioner asks, so much of the anti-trans vitriol of our current moment is centered around making it seem like transness is a new and alarming phenomenon rather than an experience that humans have had throughout history. In addition to your work, are there other books or resources you'd recommend sharing to educate those who have encountered anti-trans propaganda along those lines, like the idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria?
Yes, I mean, it's very hard, to combat nonsense like rapid onset gender dysphoria, because, well, it's propagated so widely by such well-organized and well-funded groups. I mean, it is a kind of a mission, to do that. And at the heart of it lies this big desire to use trans people as a wedge issue to get rid of women's reproductive rights. So, we're talking about people who have opposed and continue to oppose termination of pregnancy, for example, who oppose and continue to oppose contraception, who believe that women have a very particular role in society that is God's will, and that's immutable. So opposing that is tricky. I actually think it's, in a way, helpful to go back and just see that there was that period and to know it. But the arguments that we need to make are arguments for today. There's a great book by a young trans writer over here, Sean Fay, called The Transgender Question. That's really excellent. It focuses on the 20th century and it runs all the way through, prisons and the health system and so on. And just having the facts at your fingertips, just being able to say, okay, so actually, when we talk about in the UK trans people in prison, we're talking about probably less than 10. When we talk about numbers, we're talking about less than 1% of the population. We're actually talking about a group that is, in the larger view, more or less statistically unnoticeable. So I think going for the facts and just asserting them, the thing that, when I was doing the research, the thing that people found most helpful was just the simple biology, of the way in which human biology works is every fetus starts out as female, and then it may stay that way, it may proceed to male, it may be somewhere in the middle. We have had intersex people and intersex conditions, and we've had people in the middle for several thousand years. We've known about this. It's just a fact of life. It's a variation of sex development. And if we have a variation of sex development, then we should accommodate it. And if we think about sex and gender, well, we can't really think about one without the other. They're mutually constituted. So it's convenient for us to talk about gender because it's a much more embracing notion than sex. If we just separate out biological sex from gender, if we split them, and we can split them. Obviously, we do to think about them, but not in real life. You can't separate them in real life. So, because if we did separate them in real life, then and value people only by sex, then we're treating people like plants, you know? And the only value that they then have is their ability to reproduce, which is a really gross way of thinking about people. You know, so we can't practically separate sex from gender. And since we've got diversity of sex, we have to have diversity of gender. We just do. It's always been there. It always will be there. It changes, it ebbs and flows, but there's never any reason why we should have equality. And it's a bit like someone said to me, oh, my uncle's against gay weddings. And I just said, well, he probably shouldn't have one then, you know? If you don't like it, don't do it. That's fine. There's lots of things that, you know, I don't like and don't do, but leave everyone else alone.
Of course. Well, that is all the time we have for questions. I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening and for sharing with us this story that I think I speak for everyone else in the audience by saying that this has been incredibly eye-opening, incredibly illuminating. Thanks to all of you out there for spending part of your evening with us. Please learn more about this incredible book and purchase The Hidden Case of Ewan Forbes at harvard.com. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, enjoy the rest of your week. Keep reading and stay safe. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Have a good night.